the creator and host of From Black Power to Black Trauma. In episode 1, I explained the genesis of the podcast, which arose from the publishing industry's reluctance to consider my proposed book project, From Black Power to Black Trauma, that challenged today's trauma narrative in post-civil rights discourse. Episode 1 did a deep dive into the concept of trauma and how it is now applied to describe the social, political, economic outcomes affecting some blacks. Essentially, I am arguing that blacks are not traumatized, but have politically demobilized themselves over the last 50 years, creating phantom politics, the appearance of political action. Episode 2, The Lost Agenda, will look at the sources of what I call phantom politics.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King.
August 28, 1963. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
By 1965, America had released a tranche of those insufficient funds via the Public Accommodation Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However,
it was limited to 3 things only.
Bayard Rustin, the chief organizer of the March on Washington, and perhaps the Negro freedom movement's most astute tactician and strategist.
The right to vote, the right to use public accommodations, and the right to send your child to school of your choice. It had nothing to do with the North, fundamentally. It had only to do with the South, and it did not address itself in any way to the economic and social problems of black people. It succeeded because its objectives were very concrete and exceedingly limited. But when you get into the question of full employment, hospital care, the nature of work, medical care, then you are no longer talking about civil rights.
In other words, we're talking about improving the material conditions of a specific class of people, as President John Kennedy himself noted months before his assassination.
The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about 1/2 as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much chance of completing college. 1/3 as much chance of becoming a professional man. Twice as much chance of becoming unemployed. About 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year. A life expectancy which is 7 years shorter, and the prospects of earning only half as much.
However, in order to improve those statistics, labor leader A. Philip Randolph and Rustin introduced the Freedom Budget for All Americans, which sought to have the government implement it as a national policy. It had called for expenditures of close to $20 billion a year over a 10-year period. It was also a radical proposal that called for, among other things, the elimination of poverty, providing medical services, educational opportunities, a guaranteed income, and full employment. It was positioned as a budget for all Americans, but would proportionately benefit blacks since they tended to be mostly affected by rising unemployment accompanying new technology and automation that was rolling through manufacturing, a clusterfuck of things. The 1966 midterm election increased the number of Republicans in the House. Despite the promises of the Johnson administration's Great Society program, the administration began a deeper involvement in the Vietnam War. Liberal activists turned from civil rights to opposition to the Vietnam War. The urban riots in northern western cities, the white backlash against black aspirations, and rising calls for black power also doomed the budget from being considered. The momentum to launch or mobilize the Freedom Budget was lost. The 1966 midterm may have been a motivating factor for King to stir debate about poverty via his announcement of a Poor People's Campaign. King wanted a serious commitment to eradicating poverty, presenting opportunity, and a basic guaranteed income. That would mean, however, returning to a previous form of struggle, regressing from politics to protest. The Poor People's Campaign was launched after King's 1968 assassination. The campaign, however, died miserably in a muddy encampment on the National Mall, bookending the triumphant march on Washington, and did nothing to advance its goal. The inability of the civil rights movement, along with white America's unwillingness to jumpstart a second phase that would tackle economic and social problems, would have dire consequences. Those blacks who are not middle class but depended upon entry-level jobs, especially those in manufacturing, would become redundant or expendable. As writer and activist James Boggs noted in The American Revolution, pages from a Negro worker's notebook, automation replaces men. This, of course, is not new. What is new is that now, unlike most earlier periods, the displaced men have nowhere to go. The farmers displaced by mechanization of the farms in the 1920s could go to the cities and man the assembly lines. As for the work animals, like the mule, they could just stop growing them. But automation displaces people, and you don't just stop growing people even when they are made expendable by the system. In the United States, with the automation coming in when industry has already reached the point that it can supply consumer demand, the question of what to do with the surplus people who are expendable of automation becomes more and more critical every day. Where do these people go? Where did they go? The newly expendables were the descendants of blacks who were freed from slavery roughly 100 years before. Then they had somewhere to go. They could stay on the plantations in the South or leave for cities up north. Back in the day, they had somewhere to go. However, by the 60s, the cities of the North were spitting them out and corralling them into urban Bantustans called ghettos. Blacks without any power were merely playing out a role that had been assigned to them centuries ago. Thus wrote Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloward in their 1979 book, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed and How They Fail. No group in American society has been as subjected to the extremes of economic exploitation as blacks. Each change in their relationship in the economic system has merely represented a shift from one form of extreme economic subjugation to another, from slaves to cash tenants and sharecroppers, from cash tenants and sharecroppers to the lowest stratum in an emerging southern rural free labor system, and finally to the status of an urban proletariat characterized by low wages and high unemployment. And in fact, the black poor progressed from slave labor to cheap labor to, for many, no labor at all. Black leadership of that era has spectacularly demolished Jim Crow segregation in the South within 10 years. Exhausted and without a tribune such as Martin Luther King, they had failed to implement a plan to address the socio-economic plight of working-class blacks and poor Americans in general. The plan that they had, the Freedom Budget for All Americans, depended upon building a coalition to pressure the White House and America into social democracy. That potential coalition became distracted. By 1968, with the death of King and cities smoldering, the Negro freedom movement was over. Now it was nation time. The resurgence of black nationalism, typified by the exhortation of black power, would proclaim that now was the time for black liberation and unity without uniformity. While as a movement it represented the transformation of Negroes becoming black people, black power was so amorphous and nebulous that even a Republican president could pimp it.
The nationalist must be the spine to the black nation, not some kind of weird projection off the side of his head going off at a right angle.
Amiri Baraka.
The nationalist must be the spine of the body of the black nation. What the nation does, the nationalist must make him do a little better, a little faster.
Formerly Leroy Jones, poet, writer, activist, the last angry black man, a follower of
Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair?
Malcolm X, the man who traumatized white America.
Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other.
Along with King, Malcolm X is considered by many one of the most influential black Americans in American history. As Bruce Perry, his biographer, said of him, he fathered no legislation. He engineered no stunning Supreme Court victories or political campaigns. He scored no major electoral triumphs. Yet, because of the way he articulated his followers' grievances and anger, the impact he had upon the body politic was enormous. He mobilized Black America's dormant rage and put it to work politically.
Whites can help us, but they can't join us. There can be no black-white unity until there is first some black unity. We cannot think of being acceptable to others until we have first proven acceptable to ourselves.
Malcolm's call for unity was based upon being black, color, a so-called Negro. There was a presumption that blackness trumped all considerations in the movement towards civil rights and or human rights. To some degree, it did matter. In other ways, it did not. As a spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X represents the latest iteration of black nationalism that had been percolating, bubbling up through the black population for over 100 years. However, as writer E.U. Isiam Udom noted 60 years ago in Black Nationalism, A Search for Identity in America, the Nation of Islam is not a political movement. Although black nationalism is ideally a separatist type of political ideology, the Nation of Islam is in fact apolitical. It is also non-revolutionary. The teaching of its leaders, Elijah Muhammad, revealed his utter distrust of political action, other than in a Negro-controlled state, and as an effective means for the Negro's attainment of status apart from civil rights in American society. Who can recall Stokely Carmichael's name and not associate it with the two most incendiary words of the 1960s, Black Power?
We want black power! We want black power! We want black power! We want black power! What
he was also one of the movement's most polarizing figures. In the eyes of many civil rights activists, especially white liberals, it was Carmichael more than anyone who contributed to the dissolution of the Grand Alliance, civil rights Negroes, labor, church, liberals, and the Democratic Party that sent the movement crashing into black power, thereby provoking white backlash. But for others, like Carmichael himself and many blacks of that era, it was time for black liberation and not token integration.
We want black power. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power. What do you want? What do you want?
A year after Malcolm's death in 1965, along with the retreat of the Negro Freedom Movement, black power stepped into the breach and became for roughly 10 years the dominant ideology for the newly emerging black nation that was once populated by Negroes.
Liberation is not about being killed. We are not interested in no suicide. We want to live. We want a new life. We want a life that we remember vaguely sometimes in the back of our heads as a liberated African people.
By the early 1970s, blacks were becoming elected officials, taking over cities such as Gary and Cleveland. In 1972, black leaders, which included moderates, black elected officials, prominently the Black Congressional Caucus, intellectuals, and nationalists, all inspired by the concept of black power, attempted to engage in unity without uniformity at the National Black Political Convention held in Gary, Indiana.
We believe that that the development of black people depends on their first unifying, and it also depends on them being able to create political structures, actual structures to transform their potential into power.
This is where Baraka enters. By the late 60s, he had morphed from being a Greenwich Village beat poet to a full-fledged black nationalist, as well as the prime instigator of the black arts movement.
We're trying to create a community, which has to do with people coming together, and evolving a specific political culture based on that diversity.
He had also gotten a taste of power by helping Kenneth Gibson, a Newark, New Jersey civil engineer, become the first black mayor of Newark in 1970.
I think one of the important things that come out of the convention, a steering committee has been named, chairmen from 50 different states plus national organizations, to put together a method of electing a national assembly, which would be about 427 black folks, a minimum of 2 per state, and the rest proportionally elected. Actually, 10% of the amount that came to the convention.
Baraka had a vision of a national black community that was diverse but bounded by a common heritage that would allow for unity without uniformity. From March 10th to March 11th in 1972, close to 10,000 people showed up at the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana.
Now, what this assembly would try to function much like a Congress or a National Assembly of a nation, of a country, which would very consciously try to involve these diverse groups on a continuous basis. And there'd be no attempt to dominate by one group, that all the groups would be able to come together in a well-organized, evolving political structure.
A national black political agenda was devised in hopes of structuring a future political assembly that would serve as a sort of black Congress.
We need a political structure, a concrete political structure, whether we call it a party or we can call it a banquet, you can call it anything you want to. But we need a concrete political structure that will allow black people, even though they might be black Democrats, they can remain black Democrats, as long as they can also, understand that they should and eventually will feel they must contribute to the development of this black political structure.
Ironically, by trying to structure a national black political assembly, Baraka and the black nationalists were going from protest to politics, but exclusively with only black people. The political diversity of blacks trumped a presumed unity based on blackness and black power. Black power, however, meant different things to different people. To some, such as the NAACP's Roy Wilkins and the Urban League's Whitney Young, it was an extreme position and smacked at reverse racism. Even Richard Nixon wanted in on the game, defining black power as black capitalism.
Aspects of black power are very disturbing to us because it means revolution. It means violence. But other aspects of black power are very constructive because it means that black people, they want to stand on their own feet. They want to have black banks and not just go to white banks. They want to have black businesses and not just go to the white businesses. And they should have.
Black power activists decried and denounced black capitalism, but Nixon used black power activist rhetoric about black self-help and the banner of black economic development via black businesses as a means to neuter their demands and rhetoric. The moderate wing of the civil rights movement had a budget it couldn't get past Congress. Other than advocating a black development bank and a demand for reparations, the National Black Political Convention didn't do any better.
Yeah, I think so. I think that Democrats can take the black vote for granted because most of the people who function in the black community have been Democrats, you see. But I think that's over, certainly. I think that the taking for granted, not only by the Democrats, but any white-controlled institution, or any institution that is not clearly, controlled by black people for the benefit of black people, it's all over.
However, issues such as busing and solidarity with Palestinians and criticism of Israel caused controversy, as well as Baraka and the nationalist contingent's attempt to foist the agenda on attendees over 3 days. It undermined the convention. Feeling the sting of criticism from the media and the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus took ideas from the Black agenda and morphed them into a Black Bill of Rights and a Black Declaration of Independence. There was no buy-in from the black public at large, and attempts to promote the National Black Political Assembly failed during the 1970s. To numerous other blacks, adherents of Malcolm X, they were tired of waiting and wanted action. And action is what some of them got if they went the way of the Black Panther Party, which was viciously repressed by the FBI and local police forces nationwide.
Well, I've seen some fantastic statements that made that practically all of our agents in the Deep South officers are men who've been born and reared in the Deep South. I can say that 70% of the agents in the 23 Southern offices were born in the North.
J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI and the architect of COINTELPRO, also known as the Counterintelligence Program.
I don't share the feeling that is been advanced by some extremists that a man, because he's born in the South, can't conduct or won't conduct a fair, impartial investigation of any case that is assigned to him, whether it be a racial case or whether it be a criminal case. I am confident that every agent in this Bureau, from wherever he may come, whatever race he may be, or whatever color he may be, will conduct his duties as a responsible, dedicated man, but as certainly do not and will not give protection to civil rights workers.
Hoover certainly wasn't going to give protection to civil rights workers because his agency was busily undermining them. The 70s began with black people who recently shared their Negro identity and embraced their blackness. The Black Power slogan was the most obvious expression of this new identity and feeling of collective solidarity. This new identity had implications of power. What did Black Power actually mean, and how were blacks going to achieve it? Black Power, along with the demands for self-determination and black control, and the hoisting of black unity and nation-time banners meant that a resurgent black nationalism had entered the void left by pro-integrationist forces. Despite the rhetoric and posturing, black nationalism revealed that it had no clue as to how to go about addressing the material deficits of urban blacks. Despite the rhetoric of unity without uniformity, Black Power nationalists like Amiri Baraka failed to deliver what he claimed would be the hallmark of the 1970s.
I think that the 70s, one clear thing will come out of this decade is the creation of some strong black political structure that will evolve more and more to a direction giver.
That did not happen. Black power nationalism failed to turn the ideology of blackness into a workable program of either political mobilization or economic development. It was also for that very reason, meaning the inability to provide any sort of political or economic infrastructure for the masses, that cultural nationalists such as Amiri Baraka and other black power activists wanted to align themselves with black elected officials, while also challenging their failure to serve the people. Black elected officials had some connection to power, and the National Black Political Convention was an attempt to tap into that by building a political struggle that would guide the newly forming black nation that was based on unity without uniformity. Black elected officials knew one thing about the black nationalists. They had no real grassroots mobilization. They had no relationship with the masses. They had no relationship with voters. Because after all, black elected officials count votes. This, among other things, defeated black power. Neither the civil rights movement nor the black power movement built on the successes of the 1960s. As a matter of fact, we could say the 1970s was an era of the lost agenda. No economic program, no black power nation, no radical oppositional challenge, no organizational framework for black grassroots mobilization, and no self-improvement. When the people have no vision, they perish. This has been From Black Power to Black Crime. I'm Norman Keller. Thank you for listening.